this is better now. So I'm from my name's Tabitha Konamblum. I'm from Women's Electoral Lobby. We and Immigrant Women Speak Out are hosting this event jointly. And I'm going to ask Colin Mitchell to do the welcome to country. Colin is a Darug from the Darug country and a local person. So.
Okay, I've been asked to use the microphone instead of using my big voice. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Colleen Mitchell. I'm a very proud Darug woman from the rural clan. I was born again through the Stubbings and Locke families with unbroken family and historical ties here to Blacktown. I offer you today's welcome on behalf of my father and Darug elder Colin Gale. I acknowledge that for many nations, a welcome can only be delivered by an elder, but for Darug people who were first impacted by colonisation, we have seen the need to pass down traditions and protocols to ensure our histories, cultures and languages are not lost. In delivering today's welcome to country, I ask you not to simply listen with your ears, but to truly hear with your heart, because when I welcome you to my country, I welcome you to my culture. And when I welcome you to my country, I'm honouring the ancestors and their age-old traditions. I was born and raised here in Blacktown, something I'm very proud of. Blacktown was named at the time the Blackstown, and it was named because of the Darug population that was here long before the white men came. This land holds immense cultural, historical and spiritual significance, not just for Blacktown, not just for New South Wales, but for all of Australia. The daughter of Yarramundi, known as the chief of the Richmond tribe, was the first child enrolled in the Parramatta Native Institution. This institution later moved to Blacktown on the corner of Rudy Hill Road North and Richmond Road. She gained notoriety when she scored the highest result in the annual exams, higher than the 20 Aboriginal students enrolled in the institution, but also higher than the 100 or so English-speaking students at the school she was not allowed to attend. Due to this achievement, a convict named Robert Locke, who had helped to build the Blacktown Native Institution, was actually assigned to this amazing young woman. They later married in what was the first official marriage between an Aboriginal and a non-Aboriginal person in all of Australia. So not just here in Blacktown, not just here on Darug country in Western Sydney or the Sydney Basin, but actually in all of Australia. Maria's brother Colby, with his friend Nurraginji, were ironically awarded the first ever land grant given to Aboriginal people in Australia. So these beautiful young men who had lived on the land and off the land for all of their life were suddenly gifted a section of land and told that that was their reward for helping to go look for the so-called natives that were killing off the sheep and the farmers' livestock. That land was registered in 1819 and it stayed with Colby and then with Maria until her death. This grant and the one provided to Maria on her wedding date were actually later revoked. So they lived on the land, they lived from the land, they cared for the land, they were given land grants, only to have them taken away some years later. It is these stories and these facts that Darug people work so hard to preserve and promote, because we do not have constitutional recognition as Australia's first. How can it be that officially our history begins in 1770 when someone determined that this land belonged to no one? When my family predates colonisation and we have recorded history of that. So I don't think my history begins in 1770. It is my privilege to welcome you to Darug land, and in doing so I have shared with you some of the history about my people, my ancestors, whom I pay the utmost respect to for their bravery and their tenacity. I pay respects to the elders and wise ones of today who carry on these stories to ensure that they are not forgotten. I acknowledge all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here in the room today and recognise that wherever you come from, it is and always will be traditional Aboriginal land. I also thank the non-Aboriginal people who are here to walk with us, to support us in gaining the recognition we so rightfully deserve. So thank you for joining us on Darug Country today. It is my privilege to welcome you to country, but also to my history, and hopefully to what we will decide will be our future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Colleen, for that gracious welcome to country. As somebody who's lived on the Darug Nation for 33 years, I'm still learning as well, and it's always lovely to be welcomed. Thank you so much. My name's Kitu Randawa, and I'm your facilitator for today. I'd just like to first thank the Women's Electoral Lobby and Immigrant Women Speak Out for putting on this event, which I think is very important and very significantly so here in Blacktown. We are going to move forward now, and we're going to hear the Uluru Statement from the Heart. And if I can ask Ruby Langton-Batty to read that out, please.
I'll stay.
Yeah, so that you're sure.
Thank you, Colleen, for that beautiful welcome. I'd also just like to acknowledge traditional owners and ancestors and any other Aboriginal people who are in the room today. And thank you to the Women's Electoral Lobby for organising this wonderful event. So I'll just read out the Uluru Statement from the Heart. We, gathered at the 2017 National Constitutional Convention, coming from all points of the southern sky, make this statement from the heart. Our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander tribes were the first sovereign nations of the Australian continent and its adjacent islands, and possessed it under our own laws and customs. This our ancestors did according to the reckoning of our culture from the creation, according to the common law from time immemorial, and according to science more than 60,000 years ago. This sovereignty is a spiritual notion. The ancestral tie between the land, or Mother Nature, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who were born therefrom remain attached thereto and must one day return thither to be united with our ancestors. This link is the basis of the ownership of the soil, or better, of sovereignty. It has never been ceded or extinguished and coexist with the sovereignty of the Crown. How could it be otherwise? That peoples possessed the land for 60 millennia, and this sacred link disappears from world history in merely the last 200 years? With substantive constitutional change and structural reform, we believe this ancient sovereignty can shine through as a fuller expression of Australia's nationhood. Proportionally, we are the most incarcerated people on the planet. We are not an innately criminal people. Our children are alienated from their families at unprecedented rates. This cannot be because we have no love for them. And our youth languish in detention in obscene numbers. They should be our hope for the future. These dimensions of our crisis tell plainly the structural nature of our problem. This is the torment of our powerlessness. We seek constitutional reforms to empower our people and take a rightful place in our own country. When we have power over our destiny, our children will flourish. They will walk in two worlds, and their culture will be a gift to their country. We call for the establishment of a First Nations voice enshrined in the Constitution. Makarrata is the culmination of our agenda. The coming together after a struggle. It captures our aspirations for a fair and truthful relationship with the people of Australia and a better future for our children, based on justice and self-determination. We seek a Makarrata Commission to supervise a process of agreement-making between governments and First Nations and truth-telling about our history. In 1967, we were counted. in 2017, we seek to be heard. We leave base camp and start our trek across this vast country. We invite you to walk with us in a movement of the Australian people for a better future.
Thank you. So just before I introduce our eminent panel, there's a little bit of housekeeping to do. I'm firstly obliged to ask you, does anybody object to this event being filmed? Because we do want to use this panel discussion later on leading up to the referendum vote. So if you have any objections, let us know. Looking around, there doesn't seem to be, so that's great. If anybody wants to move further forward, please feel free to do so. The other thing is, if you haven't already been familiar with the room, the toilets are towards the back, just behind those walls. If you go down there, there are unisex toilets. If we are required to evacuate the building, I'm sure there will be a sound or some sort of thing. There are 2 emergency evacuation points there, but most of us will probably go through the main door where Mr. Maxwell is standing. And please don't use the lifts if we should need to evacuate the building. Just make your way outside. But as we often say, just follow the staff because they know where they're going. Okay, thank you for that. A couple of other things is that this is quite a passionate debate for many people, probably everybody in the room. So there may be some things that people are uncomfortable with or may feel that it is not quite in keeping with what they think, but we ask you to be respectful. Respect the panel speakers, respect their opinions, and in return, we will respect your position as well. We're not expecting anything as in a huge debate here, but we are encouraging you all to ask questions. This is your opportunity. You've got some very talented people on the panel, so if there's something that you've always wondered about, this is probably a good opportunity to ask about it. Okay, so moving right along, we now have, again, before I introduce the panelists, we're going to have a message from the Federal MP for Greenway and Minister for Communications, the Honourable Michelle Rowland. Going to do it again. Okay. Apologies for the vocals there. The audio didn't seem to work quite as well, but I'm sure that the Women's Electoral Lobby and Immigrant Women Speak Out will make sure that that speech is available for you to see on social media or in other places as well. Okay, now moving right along, we are going to now introduce the panelists, my favourite part. I'd like to first introduce Colleen Mitchell, who you've already heard give us the welcome to country, who is an educator and proud Darug woman. The next we have Professor Gabrielle Appleby, who's the law faculty, who's part of the law faculty in University of New South Wales, and advisor to the Uluru Statement from the Heart. Nalika Padmasena, who is the president of the Sri Lankan Australian Women's Network. Ruby Langton Batty, a solicitor and proud descendant of the Bidjara and Iman peoples of Central Queensland. Anita Hanna, the Director and Programs of Policy and Programs at Western Sydney Community Forum. Okay. So moving right along, I think we're getting to the first question here, and which I'm going to direct to hopefully start the conversation off with Colleen. The proposed law is to alter the Constitution to recognise the First Peoples of Australia by establishing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. Could you? You were nearly going to have to shout then, Colleen. So if we can start with you and ask you, why is a change in the Constitution necessary to recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and give them a voice?
So for me, it's quite simple, speaking from an Aboriginal perspective. When we are born, we are gifted a birth certificate. Our constitution is the country's birth certificate, and at this stage for Aboriginal people, we are not on that birth certificate. So I would like to see representation of not just Darug people, obviously, but Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people from across the country to be represented in that. So for me, it's as simple as that in terms of the change to the Constitution. When it comes to the voice, for a very long time now, we've had decisions made for us. Sometimes we're asked to consult, and sometimes that consultation comes in the form of, Colleen, we've been working on this project for 6 months now. If I give you a summary, can you tell me what your thoughts are? And then I might provide some feedback. And then 6 months down the track, I said, now that we've been going for a year, can you give us another insight? That's not consultation. And if that's our belief of consultation, then we need to get rid of the word consultation and change it to partnership, because people should not be making decisions for us. So it's not about us without us. So for me, it's as simple as that. It's not necessarily the opinion of everyone else, and so obviously I am giving you my personal opinion, but I would like to see myself recognised in the Constitution as an Aboriginal person, and I would like to have a voice in the decision making for my people so that we can see progress.
Thank you. That was very succinct and very understandable. Would one of the other panel members like to add to that? Gabrielle?
Oh, thank you. One of the points about recognition is we know that across Australia, Australians across the political divide want to see the birth certificate of Australia, as Colleen just referred to, the Constitution, recognise the place of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Currently, the Australian Constitution says nothing, absolutely nothing about that history, about that culture. And so we know there's this broad support for recognition. But what we also know from the amazing process that sits behind the Uluru Statement that Ruby read out a moment ago, that when Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people themselves were asked, do you want recognition in the Constitution? What would that recognition look like? We know that their response was, we seek recognition that would speak to our structural disempowerment, not just symbolic recognition. We are seeking recognition through voice, and that's about the voicelessness that Colleen just spoke about. So if we want to do recognition, which Australians generally want to do recognition, and we want it to be a respectful recognition, we are seeing First Nations people in the way that they are asked to be being seen, then it's recognition through voice, because that's what they are seeking. They're not seeking symbolic recognition, they're seeking something that will make a difference.
That makes it very clear. Thank you. Does anybody else want to add to that?
Hi, I just wanted to say, I think one of the biggest things with our constitution, and I was born in Australia, so this is all I know, is that it doesn't acknowledge that anything existed here before Captain Cook landed. So I'm not sure that that's going to be what we want or what our ancestors would want of us in supporting and being allies to First Nations people. I believe that this will be a step towards healing for the nation. The voice piece is clear. It's about the evidence that tells us communities should be involved in decisions that impact them. Individuals should be involved. Like if someone came into my house, I think they need to talk to me about how things would work best for my family. And that's what the voice is about. Yeah, Colleen, I agree. It's very simple. Sorry about I'm not a singer, so I don't use a microphone.
Well, I think you've put it very succinctly for many of us. Thank you, Anita. Just moving on to the next question, and probably this is the most asked question around people in groups and families, is what is the voice and how will it work? Why not just pass a law for the voice? So I'd like to start, if I can, with you, Gabrielle. If you could give us a little bit of an explanation around this, please.
Yeah, sure. So the idea of the voice comes from the structural disempowerment and sense of voicelessness. And throughout the regional dialogues, the First Nations delegates from across Australia, who have all different historical experiences of colonisation and post-colonisation, but they all spoke of one thing, which was voicelessness. So the idea of the voice, people say, well, what's, the voice is something that we've never really heard of, but it speaks to voicelessness. And that's why the concept of voice is being put forward. But the constitutional provision explains what the voice is. It's going to be a new body, right? The Prime Minister has referred to it as a committee that's going to represent Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So it's the idea of a new representative body. Of course, we've had representative bodies for First Nations people in the past. We've never had it in the Constitution before. That's really important. And of course, the Uluru Statement from the Heart asks for it in the Constitution. That's for a couple of reasons. First, because it gives that recognition that currently doesn't exist. But secondly, for many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, they have lived through bodies, committees that have been set up by government to consult and then being dismantled by government, whether that be through just an executive government policy decision or through the passage of ordinary legislation. Now that leads to extreme instability, it leads to a lack of certainty, and there is a corresponding lack of independence. Are you going to speak truth to power if your existence is going to be determined by the government? The constitutional enshrinement of the voice, rather than just passing it through another piece of legislation, is a key part of its power. It's not going to have a veto. It's not going to be a lawmaking institution. It's going to be a representative body that provides advice, and it's going to need to have stability and independence, and the Constitution is going to give it that stability and independence.
Thank you. Just from what you've said, if I can just ask a slightly additional question from that, is it also true then that if you pass a law, laws can just be amended and changed from government to government, but this would mean that it can't for the layperson?
Yeah, constitutional enshrinement gives us a certainty and stability for the existence of the body and also for its core function. The constitutional amendment includes a provision that says the voice will make representations to the Parliament and to government on matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. That cannot be taken away by a single piece of legislation. So there's that constitutional protection for its existence, but also for its core function. And then there will be legislation that provides some of the detail around how it's going to operate at a day-to-day level, exactly how many members are required, just like legislation provides for that in relation to the other institutions, the Parliament, the High Court, etc. So that's very consistent with our constitutional traditions.
Thank you. That makes it clearer. Ruby, if I can come to you now. If you wanted to add to that, otherwise I'm going to go into the next question.
Oh, yeah, just go to the next question.
Okay. Again, this is a commonly asked question. How will changing the constitution make a difference to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's disadvantage when so many other approaches have failed?
So the voice proposal is essentially that we get to have a say in the matters that affect us. So what the current status quo is that when the government, as has already been explained by Colleen, when the government makes laws about us, it is not required to consult with us, and usually what happens is a top-down approach, and our people and our communities and our children and our lives become the subject of a political football. We know what is best for us. And there's a lot of examples of this, and the best example that I like to point to most recently is the implementation of the COVID vaccine rollout, where we're very lucky to have Aboriginal medical services across the country that provide essential services in health, but also in lots of other areas. And they were able to very quickly, because we have ancient decision-making processes that come from our own laws and customs, they were able to quickly come up with a model that would allow us to roll out the vaccine quickly to our communities and very efficiently and cheaply. And that model meant that our communities received the vaccine faster than any other community in Australia, including the majority. And then that model was then able to be copied to other marginalised and small communities, including immigrant populations. And that meant that our vaccine rollout was very effective. So not only will we be able to design policies that we know will work for us, but maybe those policies will benefit all Australians as well.
Thank you. Colleen, would you like to add to that? Sorry.
No, I'm happy to
Share the love.
Well, I'm actually looking at from the, as a multicultural person, coming to this country. And when you're looking at, talking about the disadvantages and, whether it can be, improve life. So when you look at, like, when I arrived here, the first time, like, when I started working with migrant services, so what we did was given the voice to the newly arrived migrants to, have a better way of, navigating through the systems. So rather than, we tried, not we means, I'm talking about the community sector. So there are bodies, there were institutions, statutory bodies that advocate for the multicultural communities, and they had the voice in there. So there were lots of better ways of improving services. Same as the women and children, domestic violence, or any other, housing or any other aspects. So people were given, like, rather than working for them. So we, last 25 to 30 years, the migrant communities always advocated for, rather than working for the communities, work with the community. So that's the narrative change. So this is exactly what I can see from this. The Aboriginal, the First Nations people asking, let's work with us, like, asking us to support, to working together for the future benefit as the whole nation. That's how I see it.
Thank you, very well put, Nalika. And from that, some of the messages coming across are that it's all very well to have consultations and ask us our opinions, say there's a voice for us, but until we are part of that voice, that's where real change starts to make some real outcomes. Okay, did anybody else want to add to that one?
Oh, that's okay. I think so.
I think she did. Thank you. What great teamwork on the panel.
I certainly want to add to it. So my background's in social work, and I've worked with communities all my life and in social policy. And so opinions about the voice and whatever aside, the evidence tells us that for the health and well-being of people, they need to be involved in decisions that impact them. So it doesn't matter what you think about the voice or what's being proposed, the evidence tells us if we want health and well-being, and we want to improve scenarios where people are disadvantaged, they need to have a seat at the table and contribute to the policies that impact them. That's 101 in the work that I do. So I echo what Nalika said. Absolutely, we involve people in decision making about their lives. The other thing I think that we need to be mindful of here, I've lost my train of thought now. For me, communities as experts, we don't need people from wherever or governments to tell us how to run things in Blacktown or do what we do. We're the expert, we're the communities. Like I said, if someone comes into my home, probably me, maybe my husband, are the experts of what goes on in our space and in our life. So why would it be different at this level? The other thing I think that is critical to know is that there's been intentional exclusion of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and I'm sorry, like not my decision, but I'm sorry. So I think that, you know, of course there's going to be disadvantage. If you've been excluded from social and economic participation for years and years and years, there's going to be disadvantage. It's going to take time to catch up. What you spoke about with Maria Locke and the first landholders and that is amazing. And we need to remember things like that of when, you know, how long has it taken for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to have rights? And one more thing that I just remembered, human rights for one group is human rights for all groups. If we take away rights from one group, we take away rights from the whole. For us to thrive as a society, as humanity, we need to look after and make sure all parts of our society thrive. And right now we've been gifted this opportunity, and we can support First Nations people in that. And if the voice is the way to do that, and that's the baby step, as we'll hear later, that's what's being put forward, and it's up to us. Are we going to look after our collective by looking after some that are vulnerable?
Thank you. Gabrielle.
Thanks. This is a question we all have a mic on. I just wanted to bring some of the comments together and link it back to the change of the Constitution. So many people might agree with this idea about consultation and better decisions being made when you engage with the community. Why does that require the change to the Constitution? And I think a couple of the comments that have already been made actually emphasise that. One, as Anita said, there has been intentional exclusion of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, not just historically, but in an ongoing way, in relation to contemporary policies that continue to be rolled out in communities. And the other dimension of it, which is connected, of course, is that so often these issues become political footballs, all right? And so they become partisan. And Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people become sort of caught between Labor and the Conservative coalition, and that they and their ideas and thoughts and their lived experience is not part of that game. So that's why constitutional change is required, because we have a structural problem in Australia. And it's not just the last 5 years, the last 10 years, it's a centuries-old structural problem. It goes back to the start of the Constitution. Of course, it goes back to colonisation as well.
Thank you, Gabrielle.
Just talking about that structural, the constitutional structure. So I'm reading from this Megan Davis book. There she says the text of the 1901. So our constitution is 1901. Constitution made 2 references to the Aboriginal people. One is section 127. In recognition, in reckoning the numbers of people of the Commonwealth, of a state or the part of the Commonwealth, Aboriginal natives shall not be counted. So this is in our constitution.
Hang on, just
Yeah, so section 127 of the Constitution, together with 51(26), the races power, as at 1901, when the Constitution was enacted, excluded Aboriginal people from 2 key parts of the nation. One, from the reckoning of the people of the Commonwealth, which had effects in terms of representation, how many seats every state got in the National Parliament, and also in terms of revenue, how much money the states got. Aboriginal people weren't counted for how much money you got and for how many parliamentary representation you got. The Commonwealth Parliament was also not given the power to make laws with respect to Aboriginal people. And that was on the basis that in the convention debates, it was assumed, not implicitly, explicitly assumed, that Aboriginal people were a dying race, and that the colonies, now the states, would continue their policies of assimilation, and that would be something that would wind up, and it wouldn't be a problem for the new life Australia. That's the history. Those provisions are no longer in our Constitution. They were removed in 1967 in the referendum, the 1967 referendum. And so those exclusions and this idea that Aboriginal people were not to be included in the people of the Commonwealth has been removed. But what's been left is total silence. The racist power can now be used with respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait people. And we can talk about that a bit more in a moment, but it doesn't refer to, there is no reference to that history at all.
Thank you for that, Gabrielle. And I think it's kind of spine-chilling when we understand just to the degree of how much we've excluded Aboriginal people. It kind of really disturbs me to think that anyone thought that somebody was a dying race and therefore was not included. It's not the document, it's the, hey, these people are not going to be around in a few years' time. It just blows me away. Moving on to the next question, because I'm sure somebody's going to nudge me in a minute about time. Some Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people want a treaty rather than a voice. So why don't we put a treaty first? Ruby, if I can start with you.
Well, I was involved in this event with Tony McAvoy SC. SC stands for Senior Counsel. He's the only Aboriginal Senior Counsel in the country, and I think he answered this question extremely well. The question put to him was actually, do all First Nations people support the voice? But he also talks to the point about treaty, whether or not treaty is an important factor in this, but there might be tech issues.
Preempting that.
Okay. So in terms of just the first part of the question, treaty. No, it's too quiet. There's no point. Sorry, no, thank you. It's a shame because his answer is so amazing, because he's one of the most senior barristers in the country and has a lot of experience in native title. So I'll try to paraphrase what he says. But in terms of the treaty question, and I'd love to hear both of your perspectives on it, but it's important to understand that there are over 250 discrete Aboriginal language groups across the country. And each of these groups have their own laws and customs. We have a way of explaining the way that we live on country, which is that culture is law, law is culture. So, and our culture is derived from our land, and our language is derived from our relationship with the land. And then we speak that and we sing that culture through our ceremonies, and then our ceremonies become law. So you can see that our connection to land and our customs are intrinsically linked. So it's very important to understand this. We're an extremely diverse group of peoples. When the British first came here, they were unable to perceive the fact that there were hundreds of discrete groups across the country. And so when a lot of First Nations people say treaty first, what they're referring to is a federal treaty, which I'd say most First Nations people certainly support. It's something that most of us have had, you know, have sort of had drilled into us from a young age that we are fighting for a treaty. But treaties are already starting to happen at a state level. For example, the First Peoples Assembly of Victoria is one of the most progressed treaty processes, and they're an elected assembly that is beginning negotiations with the state. But a federal treaty is a lot more of a complicated proposition, because how do we get 250 different language groups to have a conversation with the federal government? I would propose that we would probably need something along the lines of a voice to Parliament, where each of our groups can be elected as representatives to speak to the Parliament about what we need in our own communities. And I think Gabrielle can probably speak to the Uluru dialogues and the conventions that led up to that. That treaty was something that was discussed in a lot of depth by those those leaders and participants. So do you want to speak to that?
No, I'm happy to pass that on to the
Sure, thanks, Ruby. So I was involved as a lawyer advising the Aboriginal and Torres Strait delegates at the regional dialogues, the meetings that were held prior to the National Convention at Uluru. I was involved in the Convention at Uluru as an advisor, responding to questions, providing sort of technical support, making sure everyone had the information they needed to make decisions. There was also a lot of knowledge in that room. People had a lot of experience with government, and they had a lot of course, lived experience about what was going on in their communities. And so in many respects, you know, they were the experts. I was just providing technical advice. What we heard in those regional dialogues is that, yes, there are strong aspirations for the negotiation of treaties across the country, universally. And the Uluru Statement calls for the negotiation of treaties through Makarrata Commission. But there was also a realisation that treaty is big. It should be big because it's a negotiation about future relationship. You don't want to rush treaty. You rush treaty and you're more likely to get service agreements which do not fulfil aspirations for treaty. Treaty is big and it takes a long time, and it's going to be complicated, and it needs to be resourced, right? And if you're going to negotiate with government, there's the complexity of the sheer volume of and diversity of First Nations across the country. But then there's also the reality of the disparity of power that government currently holds vis-a-vis Aboriginal and Torres Strait people. And unless you start to address that voicelessness, the structural disempowerment first, you're going to go into negotiations where there's a massive power imbalance. And that's not going to work over the line. So voice was asked for first in the Uluru Statement, not because it was seen as more important than treaty, but because voice precedes treaty, because it gives the opportunity for treaty to be negotiated on fairer terms. And it gives voice is the logistics that enables treaty to then be negotiated. It enables, you know, Victoria, treaty's now been negotiated since 2015, right? They started with the election of the First Peoples Assemblies. which negotiated the rules of the game with the government. And now, only now are they electing the body that will actually negotiate treaty with government. And that represents each of the clans from Victoria, and that will negotiate government according to the rules that the First People Assembly have set down with the government. It's a long process treaty, and it requires the negotiation of fair rules. And that's what the Voice was seen to be able to facilitate, as well as at the same time addressing a whole lot of really, really urgent issues for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in relation to their health, in relation to education, in relation to justice. And the Voice can do both of those things, the urgent stuff now, and also the longer term relationship reset with the government at home.
Thank you.
Ask Gabrielle something. Would you?
Is it true that we're
Could you use the microphone, please?
is it true that we're the only country that doesn't have a treaty with First Nations in the Commonwealth?
So it's a tricky question to answer, because we often think, you know, and in New Zealand there is a Treaty of Waitangi, so there is a singular treaty. But of course in the US there are many different First Nations tribes, and there are many treaties that are negotiated. So some tribes have a treaty and some tribes don't. Just like in Canada, some tribes have a treaty and some tribes don't. So in British Columbia, they didn't have a history of treaty negotiation, and they have engaged in a modern treaty negotiation. And in many respects have set the sort of how you might do that for Victoria. So yes, we are the only settler state that doesn't have any treaties with any of our First Nations. But it's not true to say that every other First Nation who had contact with the settler state has a treaty as well. So there are other countries that are negotiating modern treaties as well. And that's what we would be doing. We would be doing modern treaty negotiation, totally different from first contact treaties. Just think about the difference in the history and where we are today versus where we would have been had we had treaties back in the 18th century.
Thank you. I think that's often a complication that many of us are not quite across, but that was put across very well. So I think many of us can now explain it to other people too. So moving on to the next question. If there's a yes vote, will this mean special treatment for Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people? Again, something that's bandied about quite a bit. Who would like to go first on this? Colleen?
I really considered this question so that I can answer articulately, but the answer is no. We've already heard that we've actually explicitly been excluded from the Constitution. If we're not explicitly included, then we're not in the conversation, we're not being considered. Saying yes is not going to give us special treatment. Saying yes is supposed to put us on equal footing with everybody else. We've heard that other groups already have a voice that we don't have. And no offence to anybody's cultural background, but why is it that we have other groups that have a voice when our own First Nations people don't yet have that voice? So it's not going to give special treatment because we're already behind. All it's going to do is bring us up to the same level that everyone else is already at, and where we deserve to be and where we should be, because everybody should be equal and everybody should be able to have the same voice and the same power and the same decision-making options and opportunities. We currently don't have the same opportunities. We currently don't have the same achievement levels. So it is not about special treatment. It certainly is about evening the playing field is how I see it. So this one hits hard. You know, I still get, and I'm not going to speak for Ruby, but there's a good chance she'll say yes. The questions around, yeah, but Colleen, you get a free house, and Colleen, I'm sure you got a free car when you graduated high school and when you graduated with your degree. There is no free. That is a myth. There is no interest-free home loan. There is nothing that I get for being Aboriginal. And my pride in my Aboriginality is not because it's going to get me on a panel or allow me to deliver a welcome to country, or it's not about that. My pride is in my history. Just like you've all got your own backgrounds and your own stories, and you would be proud of those. It's about pride. It's not about, and this will lead to the blank check question that's coming up. It is not about what Aboriginal people are going to get in any sort of material or monetary value. It is about bringing us to the same level and to the same standard that everybody else already is at. So I feel quite passionate about that one.
You can feel your passion, you really can. And I think understand as well why you would be passionate, because the question is somewhat, I think at times a little offensive. But yes, Gabrielle, I'm not on the panel, so I'm going to hand it back to you.
Look, I just wanted to piggyback off that comment about bringing us up to the same level, First Nations people, the comment you just made. Most people don't realise that the Constitution does have a power in it to make laws for people of a particular race. Okay, and that doesn't single out Aboriginal Torres Strait people, but we know that it's only been used with respect to Aboriginal Torres Strait. Other laws in relation to immigration or defence policy have been made under other heads of powers. Laws that target people based on their race have only been made for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia. That reality of our Constitution will be addressed by having a provision that says, well, when those types of laws are made, they have to have a say in them. The other thing that many people don't realise is we have a Racial Discrimination Act that prohibits discrimination against people based on race, negative discrimination. Right? That has been suspended in Australia on 3 occasions, and every time in relation to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Only and ever in relation to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, to make laws that are negatively discriminatory against them. So this idea of structural disempowerment, the idea of bringing it up, it's not special treatment, but it's actually about giving equal voice. The Solicitor General, the government's most senior lawyer, talks about this is a provision that doesn't, not only is it inconsistent with our Constitution, will address the problem that's in the racist power and enhance the quality of decision making made by government and parliament.
Thank you. Would anybody else like to add? Anita?
I'd like to share something with permission of a personal nature. And it's my perspective, so not expecting anyone, but I come from a people who are First Nations in the Middle East and my parents migrated to Australia to escape persecution. There's been genocide up until just my grandparents' generation, so just 2 generations above, and you're looking at cultural erasure. You're looking at your culture disappearing. We're also on the endangered languages list of UNESCO, you know, things like that. And so this, to me, I see it from that broader perspective, not just of how little this, like, Australia's a little speck, the Constitution's a little speck, but if we think about the whole of humanity, the loss of culture and language is so, I don't know, this question got to me because it's much broader for me. And I think this is a way to assist in, I don't know, protecting what is the oldest continuing culture that this planet has. So that's really personal. I want to cry because I feel triggered when I talk about the personal stuff. Apologies. But to me, it's bigger than this. Is it a handout? Is it a constitution, law, this, that? This is about us as humanity protecting the oldest continual culture on this planet.
What would make my ancestors proud? I wish my parents had have known that they were benefiting from from exactly what they were fleeing, right? But what would make my ancestors proud is that I support and vote. And of course, there's going to be different views among Aboriginal people. How could we expect there not? In any group of people, we're a society, we have different views. So why would we think that they would all have the same view? All right, I think I've spoken enough. I'm getting preachy, I'm sorry.
But, thank you, Anita.
It's bigger. It's
So before we open the floor up to the audience for questions, I've got one last question for you all. And I'm going to pose this first to Colleen, then Anita and Nalika. First, will this constitutional change unite or divide us further?
This was the other one that I spent a little bit of time thinking about. We do have different views, and the different views around the country are because we have different experiences.
I'm sorry, we've just got a bit of an interruption. Okay, please continue.
We have different experiences, and that's the nature of the world. That's why, you know, people are so beautiful. If we were all the same, what a boring world we would have. But I think, unfortunately, it will continue to divide us, and the important word there is continue, because there is already division. The division is caused by the disempowerment, the fact that we don't yet have a voice, the fact that in 1770 somebody believed that we were not a civilised group of people. In 1770, because of the colour of the people's skin, and that they weren't living in structured buildings, and that they didn't have money to trade, that they were not a people that needed to be considered. And so the division has long been there, unfortunately. And so I would like to say the change will unite, but the problem is if we don't change, that division will grow. That's my worry. It's not that things will remain the same. We won't maintain a status quo. The division will actually grow, because what will be seen is that our fellow Australians don't support us and don't support Australia's history, because we all own Australia's history. It doesn't matter whether you were born here, whether you're second, third, fourth generation. If you are here, you've embraced Australia. And so it's Australia's history. And that's the important thing. It's not Aboriginal history. It's not Aboriginal Australia. It's Australia's history. And in essence, you're denying the fact that for tens of thousands of years, there were people here who were absolutely amazing. You only have to look at things like the Brewarrina fish traps. You know, how did they come up with that? How did they know to shape the boomerang to make it return, or to shape the other one to make it so it would kill? How did they design a water to make sure that the spear would travel further? You can't say those people were not smart. You can't say that they didn't have a sense of belonging and a way of life that worked. We've done far more damage in 200 plus years than they did in the 60,000 plus years that they were already caring for the land. So my concern is, and I can say this honestly, up until recently, I've been sitting on the fence, and I had a chat with Anita before to explain why I've been sitting on the fence, and it's more a Darug issue than an Aboriginal Australia issue. But I do think that the division will grow, unfortunately, because for some Aboriginal people, there is already a very strong sense of distrust. And I think it would go to increase that, unfortunately. So
If we get a no, or
if we get a no, if we get a no, the division will grow. And I didn't mean to make that rhyme, but there you go. There's your next slogan.
Thank you.
I'd really like to comment on this as well, is if there's time.
Yeah, sure. Sorry, I know I waffled.
No, it was really, it's so great to hear your perspective as a traditional owner and an intelligent woman as well. So for me, this question makes me reflect on my own family history, which is that, so on my mother's side, my descendants are Iman and Bidjara, which is a group in central Queensland. The colonial policies of Queensland were brutal, absolutely brutal. So my great-grandmother, who I was named after, Ruby Waddy, she was, and great-grandfather Ted Waddy. Ruby was the daughter of a massacre survivor, and then she was put into indentured servitude, and then she was forced to live under the Act. That was legislation, state legislation that controlled the lives of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people at the time, and it was called the Protection of Aborigines and the Control of Opiates Act, something like that. And basically what it did was create an apartheid regime which segregated Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, removed us from our country, banned us from speaking our language, and forced us into indentured servitude, removed our children from us, all kinds of brutal treatment. And she survived that, as did my grandfather. And now I'm being reunited with a lot of my cousins, many of whom live in Sydney as well, whose parents were stolen. So that's a lovely thing that I get to experience. And then on my father's side, my first ancestors in Australia came in 1788 on the First Fleet. So it's quite an interesting, so they were convicts, Mary Taylor and Gypsy Tom Batty, both criminals who were forced to be exiled as punishment for their crimes. So for me, my identity is in quite an interesting space in terms of Australia's nation, and I'm proud of both of my sides of history. But when I think about Australia Day every year, I feel so conflicted, because it makes me feel like, because it's the anniversary of the landing of the First Fleet, which for First Nations people, that represents the day of invasion. We call it Invasion Day, or the day of mourning, or Survival Day, so that we always remember we keep surviving, but we always mourn our losses as well. And I can't help but feel like the rest of Australia are dancing on our graves, but it's important to, we First Nations people love Australia, so we love Australia so much. So we want the opportunity to celebrate it as well. And I think, having our voice constitutionally recognised in our birth certificate will unite us. Aboriginal people are not a monolith. I know so many of my brothers and sisters who have Chinese ancestry, who have, African ancestry, British, Scottish, Islander. We have layered identities, and we welcome all new Australians, and we just ask for inclusion in our own country.
Thank you, Ruby. Would Nalika or Anita want to comment on that?
I think, yeah,
Nope, you're okay, that's good.
Thank you.
Okay, so that the panel can also have a bit of a breather and think about what you're going to say, I'm just going to open it up to the floor. Would anybody like to ask a question or comment on what we've heard so far? Mariam, yes?
Hi everyone, my name is Mariam. I'm originally from Black since then, and I'm also a former Black. Lovely panel discussion, and it's very informative. Thank you so much. Despite that, very a bit of thinking, how do I move this multicultural in India? Blacktown is more than this room. Now, how do you guys can help us to educate and inform the voters in Blacktown? Because we have another side that the campaign, no campaign is happening right now in Blacktown as well. So what is your take on encouraging us or investing in the community to grassroots levels to promote this voice, the big voiceless, which I can use a lot, to talk with our communities? I haven't seen much happening on that ground level.
Well, I can, like, the no campaign, like, I have seen number of no campaign questions and presentations, and also the TV ads, which are quite targeted in fear campaign. So the fear of, like, losing something, fear of, whether I am, worse off. So coming from, again, it's personal, means like, my own ancestry experience. So I'm from a country where we have suffered so much due to a fear. It's a inflicting fear in terms of working with the small minor communities within our own nation, where the people were not given voices as to working together, and we have suffered more than 30 years, financially, psychologically. The people were suffered so much. So I do not want to see that here, because if you, like, what they're saying is, if you don't know, then vote no. But that's not what it means. If you don't know, means, like, then there are lots of information out there. So this is the first stage, like, what I can see, a first stage for the First Nation people to work within themselves. And this is nothing to do with politics, or it's about the communities. So so therefore, rather than widening the gap, rather than not having a community who are supposed to be the owners of this land, who were neglected, who were totally completely wiped out when the federation is established. And now it's our, like, as a migrant communities who needs to be, like, educated, and also giving our simple chance for this to be get the right over the line, get it right, for them to, like, work together and what they wanted to achieve, because it's the voice, like, they need to talk amongst themselves, right, to what is needed for the community. So thinking of the human, we are all in a community sector, we talk about human rights. So then fairness and equality. So let's practice that, and then see, like, what we getting, as migrant communities. I think what we need to do is, like, we need to go to our own communities and explain and remove that fear from them. That's what it's required.
Gabrielle? Sorry, Anita.
I was going to say, Nalika just showed me a guide that you could go to. There's guides out there that tell you different talking points and things. So I don't know if you want to share.
Yeah, I mean, like, it's a simple answers. And also there is another event, the multicultural communities putting together on this Saturday, about, providing more information. So it's at Glenwood Community Centre. The Blacktown community leaders are coming together, putting this event on Saturday at 11 o'clock, Glenwood Community Centre. And there are, good speakers coming to that, and you might be able to get more, answers from particularly Noel Pearson, who has been working on this, quite a long time, over 12 years now. That talking point is like simple answers to the questions, rather than putting down or the negative connotations. So how we can work together, the communities work together. It's simple as that.
Thank you. Gabrielle, did you want to say something?
Look, I just wanted to say, as a non-Indigenous person, one of the incredible generosities of the Uluru Statement of Heart is it's issued as an invitation to the Australian people. And it's an invitation to say, walk with us. And it's permission to non-Indigenous communities, to multicultural communities across Australia, to step into a space, to step into this space and to talk about it, and to encourage people to inform themselves. And, my strong view is that information will provide the necessary platform for people to make a decision, and those that I have spoken to who are informed about the proposal are more likely to vote yes. So you don't have to think, I'm going to be a yes campaigner. You have to think, I'm going to be an information provider, and my strong view is that information is the best campaign in this particular proposal, because it's such a well thought through proposal. But there's permission to speak to everyone, to your friends, to your community. I'm doing an event for my little boy's childcare, and all the parents are invited. I'm doing an event at my gymnasium, and there are also, if you don't necessarily feel comfortable with the talking points or not, there's lots of people who are willing to come and speak, even to small events. Ruby and I did some excellent events yesterday in some nursing homes. It was just fantastic. Relatively small events, but really great conversations. And so if you do need speakers, there are people, and I'm sure the Women's Electoral Lobby and Immigrant Women Speak Out would be able to put you in contact with any of us. So there's people who can speak. You can speak yourself as well, though, because that's part of your Uluru Statement. It's saying, walk with us, help us get there.
Thank you.
And also, I sort of wanted to add, I think some of the difficulty can be people are happy to speak, but they're not sure what to say. And so with lots of the information out there, we can feel quite overwhelmed and not know how to sift through that. I think that's been part of the issue and why a number of people are probably sitting on the no side, because it is quite hard to sift through. I'm seeing lots of nods on, because I sat in that same space for quite some time. I have now looked through lots of information because I wanted to make sure it wasn't going to be a repeat of what we've seen in the past, of organisations established only to have them fail. My sense of what the voice will be in a simple form, and Gabrielle may be able to explain it if I've got it wrong, but I sit on Blacktown Council's Aboriginal Advisory Committee. To me, this is just a national form of an advisory committee. They will not have power to make laws. I can't go and tell Councillor Collins that I want her to do something on the advisory committee and make her do that. All I can do is advise. I can give her an opinion from my experience. I can speak for the Darug people, and I can speak from an Aboriginal perspective, but that's it. That advisory committee will listen to my words and to the words of the rest of the committee, but ultimately I have no decision-making power, and that's how I see this voice. The other thing is that it is exactly what we've said, that having the voice is the important thing. So I think if you sift through and put all of the bits of information into your sifter and shake it through, what should be left is the really simple essence that there is no lawmaking power, that, no one's going to miss out because someone's going to gain something. It's bringing us up to par, but it's essentially a national advisory committee. Have I got it wrong? Once I came to that conclusion that that's what it was, all of the other bits fell away and it became quite clear. So I hope that helps people in the room, because I think there has been certainly a fear campaign of what will you lose if you vote yes? What's going to happen? We're going to have laws that take your land away, or you're going to have to pay me if you want to go and build something on your land or make a change to your property. It's not about gaining. So I go back to that, that blank check. We're not getting anything other than equality from this decision. I hope that helps.
And also,
Thank you.
I wanted to add the learning from the COVID. So what the community leaders in Blacktown are planning to do, it's called virtual door knocking. So the community leaders are coming together, probably after the meeting tonight. So we will be talking about that.
Isn't that going to be?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, we are running out of time. And before people start to just think out of the room, I need to finish up with some formalities. First of all, I'd like to thank each and every panelist for their time, sharing their wisdom. So, also, I think nothing else, we have all learnt something today that we can actually take away to our own communities. And I know I get asked this question quite a lot. And some of the things that I've heard today have reinforced what I've said. I just feel like, well, why not vote yes? If you don't know, just vote yes. On that note, I will just hand back over to Charity, the Deputy Chair of Immigrant Women Speak Out. Thank you for your time and for putting up with me.
Thank you so much for joining us. And I just want to first say a big thank you to the panelists for joining us. Honestly, when we were first putting this together, I was initially concerned. I'm like, this is going to be way too small. And will anyone want to join this? But then I got to a certain point and I was like, actually, these conversations, no matter how small or big they are so important and that they need to be had. And regardless of it, we needed to push forth. So thank you for making the time to join us, to give us such an insightful discussion, because I thought I knew quite a bit, but I learned so much. And it's great when people come together and can share what they, the knowledge that they have. And I think in this country, I've always struggled to fit in. First as a migrant, not even honestly giving a thought to the experiences of First Nations people. And now as I am reckoning with my identity as an African Australian, I've also had to think about the experiences of First Nations people. And I can say that sometimes it makes me uncomfortable because me and my family have moved from one colonial context to another. And to be perfectly honest, I am the beneficiary of the oppression of the First Nations people of this country. And I think that sometimes that can be a very bitter pill to swallow. And I hope that, I want to do better and I want to learn more. And I want to be in these kinds of conversations. I might not always get it right. And I think that sometimes that's the anxiety we all have. It's like, what if I say the wrong thing? What if I do the wrong thing? But sometimes our mistakes are our biggest, teachers. We learn so much from it. And so I'm glad that I was part of this and that you could all join us in this moment to have this discussion, because it was a very important discussion to have. And I encourage everyone to continue to have these discussions, go out into your communities, even when they are very challenging and difficult, even when you don't know the answer, just say, I don't know that, but I can find out, and continue that conversation. Because I think that that's the way that we're going to bring people around, because it is very important that we get to the, you know, the yes finish line. It's unpleasant sometimes what you hear out there, but I think having these kinds of conversations means we are stronger for it. It's going to get ugly, but I think if we get this across the line, it will bring us together. And I think it marks Australia's own progress, and we can all be part of that. So, thank you.